I built everything. The house, the company, the late nights, the we'll-do-it-together plans. I believed in family loyalty the way other people believe in gravity, unshakable, invisible, carrying you through. I gave Ed a job because he was my brother. I trusted Megan because she was my best friend. I paid the mortgage, pitched in for repairs, stayed late to hit a deadline so we could afford the patio lights she wanted. Meanwhile, someone else was busy building a parallel life inside the walls I paid for. The first crack came like a petty spam email, a delivery confirmation subject line I wanted to check for her. I opened it. The subject said, "Don't let Josh find out." I read one sentence and the world rearranged itself. Dates, times. You've got 4 hours, make it count. My mom's name on messages arranging meetups like she was scheduling a plumber. It wasn't a mistake or a drunken confession. It was orchestrated. I didn't explode. I got surgical. I started collecting. Screenshots, bank transfers, time-stamped messages, evidence assembled like a war chest. By the time I left, I had a plan that fit in a manila envelope. I invited them to dinner like nothing had happened. Normal is a great camouflage. Dad, Mom, Megan, Ed, all smiling at the table. I scrubbed myself until it shone. I poured wine. I laughed on cue. I could see the lie sweating through their clothes. When the main course arrived, I slid that manila envelope across the table to Megan. She opened it, read the first page, then the second. The room shrank. Mom's fork fell. Ed's face lost its color. I handed Dad another folder. Printouts, emails, the whole operation laid bare. My voice was calm. You knew. Mom tried confusion, then tears. Ed blamed it just happened. I hit him one clean punch and watched him collapse like a clown. The rest was grim choreography, divorce papers, paternity tests, custody disclaimers. The judge later fined me $500 for that one punch, worth every cent. The paternity test cleared me. Relief. Not even close. The betrayal wasn't just the affair, it was the intention to dump a child on me like I was a charity program. After the court stuff, Mom and Megan played the long con. Run out of cash, run out of options, come begging. They wanted me to raise what wasn't mine and pay Ed's legal bills on top of it. I crunched numbers at 2 a.m., mortgage, taxes, the cost of replacing everything Megan had touched with new fixtures that had never heard her name. I froze accounts Dad allowed and used leverage where it existed. I was building a wall, brick by merciless brick. Then the funniest, darkest part, Ed filed charges over the punch. He wanted to make me the villain on paper. The judge said emotional provocation. I sighed and paid. It still felt like a win. 3 months later, they asked to meet at a diner. Classic. Mom and Megan with the baby in tow, the one they'd engineered. Mom's eyes hollowed, Megan's lip trembling like a bad weather forecast. They wanted help. Just for a little while, Mom said, voice thin as dryer lint. I listened to their practiced lines and found myself doing something I hadn't allowed myself to do, laugh. Not loud. Quiet, bitter, efficient. I slid a card across the table, a women's shelter hotline, advice on therapy, a referral to a job placement program. They stared. I stood up and left. Blocked numbers, cut ties, no dramatics. Dad quietly cut Ed out of the will and froze accounts. He called it an emergency surgical strike on their family's rot. I called it breathing. I ripped the house down to its personality and rebuilt it in a style that had never known Megan. Cabinets replaced, photos gone, tiles swapped, every room rewritten. Renovation was therapy with receipts. The contractors loved my decisiveness. I switched the lawn lights to motion sensors, a symbolic thing. New locks, new passwords, a home that smelled like paint and freshly installed blinds instead of perfume and excuses. I kept a few things. The wrought iron railing where I once nervously fixed her hair, a single cup that always had her lipstick on the rim. It was my museum now. I slept better. The taste of revenge had already faded into something more useful, momentum. Work swallowed me again, but in a different way. I poured energy into the company that had once been bait for betrayal. I closed deals, fired people who underperformed, promoted the staff who carried me through. I turned the chaos into quarterly growth charts and new hires who actually showed up. Dadding. Yes, awkward, caffeinated, refreshingly temporary. It was hilarious how some people think emotional unavailability is a personality trait. I proved them wrong. And when the competitive itch came, I bought a rental property just to remind myself I could start from scratch and win. The rent checks were tiny applause. Each prison sentence started to look like a punctuation mark in a messy paragraph. He took a plea, 18 months. The courthouse dramas became small-town gossip fodder, and I used it, not for petty cruelty, for clarity. I learned how to dodge pity and weaponize calm. When Dad announced he divorced Mom if she contacted me again, she scuttled. There's a certain poetry in watching the architect of betrayal get evicted from her own moral house. I kept emails and legal tapes secured in a safe deposit box labeled for future archaeologists. Sometimes I'd open it and read the old messages like a horror novelist studying her villain's notes. Megan moved back with her parents. She went to church more than before, clutching a rosary like a new accessory. People forgive in different time zones. I forgave nothing. I leased out the spare room in my renovated house to a tenant who was quietly excellent. He paid rent on time and laughed at my dad jokes. Life was strangely domestic again, groceries, plant watering, a friend with a key. I started dating someone who texted back within an hour and didn't cheat. It's funny how the market corrects itself when you stop giving a freeloader the upstairs suite. A former client recommended a merger that would double our small branch's reach. I said yes. Deals require trust, contracts, and people who show up. The merger brought in a partner who loved spreadsheets as I do. We took the company public on a small scale, stock options, champagne at the office, an investor who actually read the fine print. Success was quieter than vengeance but warmer. Employees who could pay their own rent, interns who thanked me for the mentorship I never had. Life had switched lanes. I was coasting with the sunroof open. One night Dad called. "We're hosting dinner for your aunt," he said. "You should come." I walked into a living room where the old stories reeked like burned pie, except this time I was the one dishing the jokes. The relatives made awkward small talk. I told the story of the 4-hour scheduling message as if it were a stand-up bit. Laughter bubbled around the room, my mother's face crumpled. It was petty, yes, but also cleansing. Humor does something vengeance can't. It turns poison into fuel. The roast of my family was therapeutic. Dad applauded aloud at the punchlines. I left lighter. I made one promise. Never again would I be the safety net for someone else's choices. I invested in my health, hired a trainer, learned a new language, bought a guitar I only half knew how to play. Self-improvement is unromantic revenge. It's live well with compound interest. I started mentoring junior managers and finding joy in their promotions more than in any lawsuit. The scars were still there, but they were less like fresh paper cuts and more like sculpture. A year and some change in, Megan's sister emailed me asking for a favor, a job referral. I could have said no. I could have set the water on simmer and watched them steam. Instead, I forwarded the resume to HR with a neutral note. People assume revenge means cruelty. Sometimes it means restraint. The hire worked out beautifully for the company, for the sister, and as a quiet proof that I didn't need to be cruel to be powerful. Eid, behind bars, heard rumors. I moved on. He sent postcards with hollow apologies. I shredded them. At an industry gala, I bumped into Megan. She looked smaller in person. We exchanged a few sentences that felt like old furniture being awkwardly rearranged. She apologized in the way people apologize when they've rehearsed it. "I'm sorry for everything," I said. "You were part of a conspiracy that cost me years." She cried, the same note I'd heard at the diner. This time I surprised myself. I didn't punch or threaten. I told her the truth, that forgiveness wasn't my currency and that I had spent the last year investing in myself instead. We parted with more honesty than we had at the altar. It felt final. Business boomed, my rental property was stable, Dad and I reconnected over old Memphis blues records. I started dating someone steady and kind, not a whirlwind but a shelter. The house had new photographs. Vacations, goofy holiday sweaters, a board game night where someone always cheated and we all laughed about it. I'd turned the wreckage into architecture, rooms with purpose, laughter that stuck to the walls. Sometimes at night, I'd look at the safe deposit box and feel gratitude for the chain of events that forced me to rebuild better. Revenge had been a phase. Living well was the ecosystem I created afterward. One last dinner. Not a trap this time, an invitation. Dad, me, a few close friends, and the tenant who'd become like a brother. My phone stayed in my pocket. I told stories about bad houseplants, worse first dates, and the absurdity of corporate team-building retreats. The chair that used to host the architect of Betrayal sat empty. The air smelled of roasted carrots and new possibilities. When someone asked what I'd learned, I said, trust sparingly, invest widely, and never allow someone else to write your cost-benefit analysis. I raised my glass to the life I'd rebuilt. Funny, careful, and undeniably mine. Dad had always been the quiet type, the kind of man whose moral compass mostly pointed north until it didn't. For years, he had ignored the subtle signs, turned a blind eye when Eid and Mom schemed, trusting that family loyalty was enough to keep his house intact. But by the time George had rebuilt his life, Dad had faced his own reckoning. After the final dinner, the one where George laughed louder than anyone else, Dad called me late one night. "I've been thinking," he said, voice rough with age and regret. "I failed you. I let them manipulate everyone in this family, and I didn't see it until too late. I can't undo the past, but I can do right now what I should have done before." I listened. Part of me wanted to nod politely, close the line, and leave him in the shadow of his mistakes. But the other part, the part that believed people could change, leaned in. Dad spent months quietly repairing what he could. He froze Mom's access to the account she had abused, made sure Eid's prison stay didn't financially destroy anyone else, and met with financial counselors to rebuild the estate he'd once left exposed to manipulation. He visited Megan's family to make amends, not with apologies that begged forgiveness, but with restitution in small, meaningful ways. He even helped a local charity for children, partly as penance, partly as a lesson for himself. By the time George's life was fully on track, the house renovated, the company thriving, the new girlfriend laughing in the kitchen, Dad had transformed into someone who actually deserved the respect of his son. One Sunday, he showed up at the renovated house, carrying a single box of old family photos. "I can't bring back what was broken," he said, "but I can make sure the future doesn't look like that." We spent the afternoon going through photos, laughing, even crying at the ridiculousness of our family disasters. For the first time in years, there was no tension, no scheming. Dad told me stories of mistakes he made as a young man, and I realized that redemption wasn't about grand gestures. It was about showing up when it mattered, owning your failures and letting your actions, not your excuses, speak. By the end of the day, I understood something important. Revenge may give you closure, but redemption, even late, even small, is what teaches the people around you how to live honestly. 1 year later, the sun hit the new patio just right, glinting off the freshly installed lights George had painstakingly chosen himself. The grill sizzled with steaks and veggie skewers, and somewhere in the background, his tenant-turned-friend was narrating the wrong rules of Monopoly like it was a TED Talk. Dad arrived, carrying a tray of brownies he had somehow not burned. "I swear these are edible," he said, setting them down beside the sparkling lemonade. His hair had gone a little grayer, his shoulders a little straighter. The man had gone from silent accomplice to active participant in life. George laughed, pouring himself a drink. "Brownies, Dad, you baked brownies." "They're my redemption brownies," he said with a wink. "One bite for every mistake I've made in the last 10 years. If you survive, maybe I'm forgiven." George raised an eyebrow. "I'm cautiously optimistic." Megan and Eid were nowhere in sight, and honestly, George didn't care. Instead, the yard was filled with laughter, the smells of good food, and the quiet music of lives rebuilt. Dad even volunteered to help set up the new grill cover, fumbling slightly but putting in effort with pride. "See," Dad said, pointing at the neatly arranged patio chairs. "I'm trying, I'm present, I'm not a liability anymore." George smirked. "Not bad, could be worse. You could be scheduling 4-hour secret missions in my house again." Dad laughed a full, unashamed laugh. Yeah, I learned my lesson. Now I just meddle in ways that are legal and delicious." He picked up a brownie, handed one to George, and said, "To family, the kind that doesn't ruin lives." George bit into the brownie. Sweet, slightly overcooked at the edges, perfect. He realized something. Vengeance had given him closure, but this living well, laughing with his dad, turning disaster into shared stories, was the real victory. And in the background, the Monopoly expert was still wrong, the grill still sizzling, and life was just good. Really, really good.